and they often are very forward thinking. It's a very interesting group. And this was really the same even back in 100 years ago. Can anyone tell me what this picture might show at the Frank Jones Brewery? Anybody got an idea? Someone raise their hand or shout it out? No one.
People picking up their beer.
People picking up their beer, that's a good guess, but notice actually that is incorrect. What this is all breweries have to dispose of their spent grains, okay, as part of the waste process, okay? And of course what they figured out early on was these grains were very nutritious as feed for animals. So Frank Jones Brewery, not the first to do it, but a major player in it, decided that instead of dumping his waste in Islington Creek, he could give it away to local farmers. So that's what they did. I think every Tuesday or Wednesday, these spent grains from the brewing process would be given to local farmers. So we see them gathered here with their wagons in order to pick that up. So farmers get something for free. So a little bit of green technology, if you will, or recycling, something to save it. It's said that especially in Portsmouth down near Islington Creek, the waters here smelled quite malty, so to speak, and it was an interesting smell in that part of town for many, many years. There were other concerns, of course, throughout the state. Manchester, New Hampshire had a satellite brewery of the Frank Jones Brewery. His brother, True W. Jones, was a brewmaster, and Frank Jones set him up with the True W. Jones Brewing Company in the late 1870s, and it lasted until Prohibition. Also, the Amoskeag Brewery, started by a lumber dealer, Andrew Wallace. Up in Somersworth, New Hampshire, or Great, as they called it back then, Great Falls, they had Ira T. Daniels, who did a lot of things. He primarily advertises his tonics, or his sodas, if you will, or elixirs and sarsaparillas, but he also brewed his own beer. He bottled ale, cider, and lager beer. We start to see lager beers being advertised. The idea of bottling locally was actually started by Frank Jones. You know, once the train comes along and the ability to transport beer in large quantities, and then it could be broken down into smaller units. So Ira Daniels was a bottler as well as a brewer. Over in Laconia, New Hampshire, in the Lakes region, we had a guy named John Champlin, who was a telescope maker, kind of, again, an odd fellow. He was involved in quite a few things, but he also brewed his own Triple X ale. We don't know a whole lot about him. And of course, I mentioned the brewery over in Walpole. Walpole, New Hampshire, way over in the western part of the state, always had a problem in that they had the most modern brewery when it was built in New Hampshire. It was built off a model exhibited at the 1876 Centennial exhibit in Philadelphia. Well, the problem was there's nobody over in Walpole, New Hampshire, and on the other side, Vermont, very low population. And he had to rely on railroad, the Boston and Maine Railroad, to get his product to market. Well, who fixed the rates for the Boston and Maine Railroad? Anybody remember? Frank Jones. He controlled the Boston and Maine Railroad. So he effectively had a stranglehold on his competition. So it was tough elsewhere through the state. So again, the major breweries in Portsmouth and Manchester. There's a few other small operators in Nashua and other parts of the state. One of the things I love about the brewing history is the old advertising pieces. You know, many of you have a church key on your keychain, or some of the coasters, or some of the neat posters, or you know, neon lights or other lights or clocks that are associated with the brewing industry today. This all started very early on. The brewing competition, especially as the 1900s approached, was very keen. The other thing was they were combating, again, those forces that wanted to prohibit beer and all liquor sales. And one of the ways they did that was with their advertisements. So here we see a 1909 calendar for the Portsmouth Brewing Company. Now the Portsmouth Brewing Company was the third of the three breweries, Frank Jones, the Elders Brewery, and then the Portsmouth Brewing Company, established by two New Yorkers in Portsmouth. And if any of you have been to Portsmouth, it's right on Bow Street, right as you curve around the harbor front there. And actually, they stored their beer, they conditioned their beer in the basement of the St. John's Church, which was right across the street. As a matter of fact, there was a tunnel connecting the two buildings, and for a fee, they paid the church to let them store and condition their ales and lagers there. If you still go in the basement of St. John's Church today, you'll see marked on the rafters the various types of beer and where they were stored and conditioned there. So again, imagine that relationship today, a brewery and a church. Probably not going to happen. Again, some things change, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. The use of pretty girls in beer advertisements it continues today, and we saw it back then. Only in this case, we have the Victorian era, so we've got this gal dressed in her bonnet and carrying this large group of roses. What are the brewers trying to do here? Well, perhaps they're trying to attract the male drinkers, but really what they're trying to portray to their audience at large is the fact that beer is for everyone. It's not just for the common individual or that immoral person that maybe the temperance movement was pointing out, but even young ladies like this love to drink beer, as represented here. So these advertisements really serve two purposes: to drive their beer, but also drive the perception of beer. Here we see the balloon captain serving this young wasp-waist lady a beer high above the Frank Jones Brewery. So again, maybe the theme of extreme sports, if you will. Coors often sponsors the X Games and things like that. Nothing new here, really. What's more exciting back then than the sport of hot air ballooning, if you will. So again, it's an exciting product, if you will. So some things never change in advertising. You want your product to be associated with something that's fun and exhilarating and exciting, and that's what beer makers tried to do. And of course, Portsmouth Brewery was masters at trying to portray that elegant setting, if you will. I love this advertisement. You got the gentleman there showing his gal. They're trying to pick a beer. It looks like Miller High Life to me. It looks like they're picking a wine out, doesn't it? It's this elegant setting. Meanwhile, you got the butler kind of with that leering grin in the background, like he knows the guy is going to make the right decision. It's all very elegant. So once again, trying to elevate beer status, because what they're combating again is that temperance movement, not just in New Hampshire but nationally. What the temperance folks were doing is trying to portray the common beer or liquor drinker as a ne'er-do-well, someone who hung out in taverns all day instead of supporting his family, and so getting that immoral slant to it. So this, again, helps combat that. And of course, the German themes in the brewing industry were very common from the 1840s onward. German immigrants, especially by the 1870s, were flocking to our country, my relatives included, in the 1860s, and so many German brewmasters made their way over to America, and it's thought that most New England breweries at one time or another probably had a German brewmaster, including Frank Jones. He had a German brewmaster, even though he had started up his business associated with an Englishman. It was quite fashionable to hire a German, and we see that German influence in this type of advertising piece. And of course, the use of children in advertisement, kind of forbidden today when it comes to beer and alcohol, but not so much back then. There was no FTC, no restrictions on beer advertising, really. So here we see the Frank Jones Brewery circa 1902. And notice this, the Frank Jones Brewing Limited of Portsmouth and Boston. They had satellite breweries outside New Hampshire and Boston and South Boston. And again, use of children on this advertising piece. Again, what a wholesome product beer was. Now, by the way, even as late as 1910, 1912, Frank Jones was brewing a wide number of beers. They had their flagship India Pale Ale, but they were also brewing what they called table beer and medicinal beers, and so all ages. There was, starting in the 1880s and 1890s, we start to see society itself putting limitations on who might drink alcohol, but there were no laws in place saying that a 5-year-old, for example, couldn't consume a simple table beer of low alcoholic content. So again, the idea of children appearing in this ad really is not unusual. It seems a little unusual to us today, but if we put it in context. is not so unusual. And same with this advertisement. I like this a lot because the idea of beer and alcohol, really, you know, this is kind of a shocking advertisement to us today. Here you got ladies and a guy in this kind of F. Scott Fitzgerald get-up, even though this is 1906, in this touring car, and they're stopping at a roadside tavern. You don't even have to get out of your car to be served, okay? So once again, standards were much different back then. We don't really advertise that fact today. So, and again, notice the elegant setting. You've got the butler or the server there pouring these fancy ladies their beer. And once again, different society at the time, different standards, but also what is Frank Jones doing? They're associating their product with the most exciting mode of transportation to come along in many years, since the railroad. Automobile ownership starts in New Hampshire in the 1890s, but by 1905, it is skyrocketing to unheard of levels. You know, and by 1915, there's, you know, automobile ownership wasn't just for the rich, it was for almost anyone. So what better way to sell your beer than to associate it with this exciting new form of travel? And you can hit the open road. Roadside taverns catered to this new form of transportation. One interesting aspect of the brewing industry that we don't often think about is how did they get their beer from one place to another with these breweries? Well, there's a number of wheeled vehicles that were used in the brewing and distribution process. And what's interesting is that one of the premier builders of these types of vehicles was the famed Abbott and Downing Coach Company of Concord, New Hampshire. Now, Abbott and Downing is known for building the Concord coach, the stagecoach that helped win the American West, if you will, or tame the American West. They also built thousands of brewery wagons, okay? So those horse-drawn wagons that delivered the kegs of beer to establishments. Here we see a salesman's vehicle. So, J. Donahoe, agent for Frank Jones Portsmouth Ale. By the way, anytime you see it referred to as Portsmouth Ale, usually means it's out of state. So this was actually up in Portland, Maine. And so the salesman for this particular distributor, Donahoe, would go around to the various establishments in town, take orders, and then the brewery wagon would deliver them. In the wintertime, what did they use? Well, horse-drawn brewery wagons, sleighs, I mean. So, Abbott and Downing actually built these not only for New Hampshire brewers, but for brewers up and down the East Coast. Yingling Brewery down in Philadelphia, they built vehicles for them and others. So, an interesting aspect and little known part. With Prohibition in 1917, the temperance movement finally won out, at least temporarily, and all breweries were closed in New Hampshire and nationwide over a short period of time. Now, many breweries nationwide did survive. You know, Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis turned to other forms of manufacturing, and other breweries did this as well in places like Milwaukee and Chicago. In New Hampshire, unfortunately, not the large population base, and none of them converted over to other forms of manufacturing. So Frank Jones went out of business. True W. Jones in Manchester, the Amoskeag Brewery in Manchester, all went out of business. And it's estimated by my research, you know, probably roughly 3,000 to 4,000 people statewide lost their job. This was a pretty big hit. Brewing did continue again, but in an illicit manner, for sure. And you know what? At least for New Hampshire, we've been able to find very little out about that. And mostly we talk about the rum runners. The feds were primarily concerned with the hard liquor that underground taverns always tried to procure. We see less about the brewing aspect, but we imagine that if there weren't home brewers by 1917, shortly thereafter, there's probably a lot of guys and gals that started up their own home brewing business. But 1932-33 comes along and Prohibition is lifted, and brewing begins again in the Granite State in a very small manner. The Frank Jones Brewery is the only one that reopens in Portsmouth, and actually they reopened in the old Eldridge Brewery. And here we see Eldridge's Portsmouth Ale being distributed And this is when the state took control of the distribution process in New Hampshire and still has control of it today. Notice the Bellevance Beverage out of Nashua. Notice the New Hampshire State Liquor Commission permit number on the vehicle. New Hampshire today still parcels out the distribution system. So Bellevance Beverage is still in business today, and they control the Budweiser distributorship, and they distribute to their part of the state, primarily in the southern tier area. And there are several other distributors that are set up throughout the rest of the state, and they have their own territory, mandated by the state and controlled. So if you think there's free enterprise in the beer brewing or distribution process, that is simply not true. The state has a heavy hand on it. If you wonder why there's a beer that you can't get, and I'll use Yingling from Philadelphia, America's oldest brewery still in operation today, it's because the state and Yingling haven't come to an agreement on allowing it to be distributed in New Hampshire. So it's a very controlled process. I love this. It shows the early delivery vehicles, these flatbed trucks, probably get to 20, maybe 30 cases in there compared to the beer delivery vehicles that we see today. So, unfortunately, brewing in New Hampshire did not last that long. The Frank Jones Ale was brewed in New Hampshire, controlled by a Massachusetts company, actually the makers of Caldwell's Old Newburyport brand rum that owned and operated the brewery. I kind of like this. New label ensures new quality. I don't know what that really means, but these are some of the earliest beer bottles I remember. We start to see this type of bottle that was very prevalent among New England brewers for many years. A wonderful brew. It's new. It really wasn't new. And even though it was brewed at the old Eldridge Brewery, they actually did use the Frank Jones recipe. The fact of the matter is things were changing in America. America's drinking habits were changed. World War II really changed the way our young men, as they grew older, drank beer. They were exposed when they were in the armed services, for example, to larger varieties of beer. And of course the Navy and the Army supplied them with beer in some cases. So some of the lighter beers like Pabst and Miller and things like that, and of course Budweiser, were supplied by the armed forces. Or on the reverse side, we had young men that were going overseas to places like Germany, or my grandfather served in a tank outfit and ended up in a little town called Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, the home of Pilsner beer. So he got his got a little bit different slant. The fact of the matter is the ale brewing industry was a dying breed in New England. And subsequently, many of these things closed as the more national brews became more important and more sought after. And here we see one of the final advertisements for Frank Jones before it goes out of business in 1952. And it shows, again, this wholesome young lady, her coupe there, stopped on the roadside, and what do? You pop the trunk and you crack open a case of Frank Jones Ale. Again, a different time, a different place, a simpler era. But Frank Jones, again, was the master at that type of advertisement, always using some fresh faces and associating with the automobile right up to the end of their operation. So in 1952, brewing in New Hampshire stops, and then we come to the modern era, and I'll give you we'll give you the final rundown on that. Matt, if you could hit the lights. So what happens? What happened to the lights? What happens after 1952? Well, of course, brewing in New Hampshire ends, and it's really from the 50s until the late 70s, early 80s. It was one of the worst periods of American brewing history because, quite simply, we brewed some of the worst beer in the world. The rest of the world laughed at the beers that we brewed because while there were some good local breweries, not in New Hampshire, these were far and few between. And we were tending toward these lighter beers that were bland in taste. If you think of the beers of the 60s and 70s that perhaps some of you may have drank, or your fathers, or whatever may have drank, it was not very good beer. okay? And, but the change came about in the late 70s, early 80s, when we started to see home brewing is really picking up again. And there's a lot of young people out there that are innovating. And this starts, you know, all over the country, but primarily in places like Seattle, Denver. You know, the West Coast really was the initiator of this. In New Hampshire, brewing returns in 1972 to Merrimack, New Hampshire, with the establishment of the Budweiser plant. Now, locals were kind of conflicted about this plant coming there, but ultimately it was great business. And so national brewing returns to New Hampshire in 1972. Was it good beer? Not really, no. Budweiser was the leader in some of these bland-tasting beers. But the craft industry, again, late 70s, early 80s, we start to see it come along, and then it explodes in the early 90s, okay? So this idea, what are we going? We're going back to the past. You know, what comes around goes around. Freshly brewed beer that really has good taste, that is, you know, locally produced. And, you know, the craft beer revolution came to New Hampshire a little bit later, again, perhaps because of our population and size. Some of the earliest innovators were the same guy that established a Smutty Nose Brewery over in Portsmouth, a guy named Peter Eggleston. He actually started a brew pub in Northampton, Massachusetts, and then brought that idea to New Hampshire. He had to sell the State Liquor Commission on it, but he got lucky and they agreed to it. So now, throughout the state, there are a wide number of brew pubs where, again, whether you get their beer in growlers to go, or some of them are starting to bottle and stuff like that. So, and you know, breweries came and went in the late 90s, the early 2000s in New Hampshire. And if you remember Castle Springs Brewery in Lucknow beer, up in Moultonboro, small Moultonboro, imagine that. I never cared for it personally. I had friends that called it Yuck Now, but you know, it was it had its following. The old Nutfield Brewing Company out of Derry was very popular for a while, and they had a great system there. They actually, the guy that failed in New Hampshire later moved to Maine and established a shipyard brewery. So, and is now sells a 7-barrel brewing system that many you know, taverns and brew pubs and small nano breweries are using. So, but New Hampshire with Smutty Nose, and then, you know, like White Birch here in Hooksett, has really been a very active place. And of course, the newest thing are what we call the nano breweries. You know, so these are breweries that are brewing, you know, less than a couple thousand barrels of beer a year. So it's all about really local, really fresh. And New Hampshire, again, despite its small size, has a really exciting brewing scene going on. We've got Throwback Brewery over in Northampton that brews some great beer, operated by 3 women, believe it or not. You have, you know, up in Conway, you got Moat Mountain, and you've got Tuckerman Brewing Company that have really well established themselves. In Hooksett here, White Birch is really well established. Can you go in a store around Hooksett without finding it? Probably not. Their tavern smoked ale I love. And then other parts of the state are doing the same thing. So I just gave this talk a couple weeks ago in Stratham, New Hampshire. They're starting up an Irish brewery down there. So that is going to be the trend probably for the foreseeable future. So, and I'm excited about it. It's hard to say. We don't know. We don't know where the brewing trend is going to be. But that's where I foresee it going, and it's quite exciting because it gives us in New Hampshire a chance to try a lot of local products and fresh products. But more important to me as a historian, it helps tie us to that historic past in a day when beer was brewed at the local tavern and at the home level and things like that. So I always tell people, you know, it's okay to drink your Bud or whatever you like. That's everybody's personal preference, but I hope you give our New Hampshire brewers a try, and I think you'll find some really good stuff out there. So, and with that, we're all set. If anybody have any questions they want to ask? Yes, sir.
Do any brewing records still exist from Frank Jones, Portsmouth, or Eldridge?
You know, I have only found the brewing advertising pieces, not been able to find any records other than tax records that are on in the public domain from the state of from the city of Portsmouth. So we know, for example, you know, what taxes Frank Jones paid, but the State House has a lot of, or the state Museum and Archives has a lot of Frank Jones stuff, and there are some brewing stuff in there to check, but as far as the day-to-day operations and some of the nitty-gritty records of the brewing industry, there's really not much to be found, unfortunately. We would like to find more, but yes, ma'am.
Now, why did Frank Jones Brewing Company fail and the Portsmouth Brewing Company?
Well, they all went out of business with Prohibition in 1917, and they just never came back after that. Remember, Frank Jones was an English concern, and again, that period in between, from 1917 to 1932, 33 was a long period of time, so there was just never any interest,
On a national scale,
Yeah.
you have canning, so the big guys out west could have more capacity and then have railroads to go all over, so you just crush the little guys.
But I guess my main question was, how did Portsmouth Brewing Company survive?
How did, you mean, well, they didn't serve, oh, you mean before Prohibition?
No, how come they're around now?
It's the same name 100 years later.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's not the same company,
It's
okay?
not.
No, Portsmouth Brewing Company in Portsmouth, that's part of Peter Eggleston and Smutty Nose. Yeah, that Portsmouth Brew Pub is that's a new entity started in the 90s, yeah, not the same company. Unfortunately, they do brew some good beer. The other thing, I'll tell you, interviewing many brewers over the course, how many of you tried a new beer and you say, no, it's a little iffy. I say, you gotta give them a second try. Sometimes they don't always, beer is very much an experimental process, and most brewers will tell you, even commercially, their first batches are not always their best. So a perfect example is Old Brown Dog Ale of Smutty Nose, which is one of their flagship brews now, but in the beginning, I thought it was terrible. And I actually told the owner of that when I interviewed him some years ago. He's like, oh, you gotta try it again. And he was right, it tasted different because, brewing is an art and is a science, and it's not always perfect every time. Anybody who's a home brewer in here knows that. It's hard to duplicate sometimes, even with all the controls. But New Hampshire, I'm proud of the state. It has a really thriving industry, so. Yes, sir.
At what point did people, originally I've heard that people drank beer and cider because the water was suspect and they didn't know whether they could get diseases like cholera and stuff from drinking well water. At what point did they stop drinking cider and beer because it was safer than water?
Well, first of all, I won't say that they ever stopped drinking beer, but as far as drinking for that reason, I think we start to see that in the 1830s and 1840s, so that's when the idea of a clean water supply and really laying out towns in proper manner and proper waste disposal starts to come along. But make no mistake about it, people, we're still drinking. Hard cider was very easy to produce. Any farmer that had a spare apple tree, and even today, is not hard to produce. So, but as far as the reason for drinking it may have changed, but by then it had become a custom. Beer was still part of the American or the New Hampshire lifestyle, and so even though the original reason and then, again, that, I think you might have come in a little bit late, but that started I spoke of that a little bit earlier before you arrived. Originally fermented beverages such as beer and meat and things like that were consumed primarily because the water supply was not safe. But the reasons for that changed over time. By the time our colonists arrived, it was almost tradition. As a matter of fact, there was clear running streams of water in New Hampshire and in Jamestown, Virginia, when it was settled in 1607. The settlers actually complained that they had to drink water rather than beer. And there was nothing wrong with the water, it just was not what they were used to drinking. And I would suspect that New Hampshire colonists were the same way. We had abundant, clean rivers, and streams around where they could drink, but that was not their preference by the time they settled here. You have another question?
Yeah, so you said that the Portsmouth Historical Society has the tax records for brewing back then. Was there like a general tax structure for brewing? Like what?
It was primarily based on the value of your holdings. For example, the Frank Jones Brewery had much larger holdings, so their tax burden was much greater than that, say, of the Portsmouth Brewery, whose holdings were much less. The parcel of land that the Portsmouth Brewery operated on was much smaller and stuff like that.
Was it like a raw materials tax too, or was it like?
I don't know about that. I don't believe so, but I did not, all I looked at was the tax records per se, and I don't remember there being a breakdown as far as materials. I think it was primarily land holdings and valuation of the property per se. Any other questions? Well, I'll hang around if anybody wants to talk beer, but I appreciate you all coming tonight, and I hope you all go home, make it home safe, and have a cold one.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
Thank you.